Welcome to the MedSpa Success Strategies podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Shockley, and this is where MedSpa and aesthetics practice owners come to discover strategies and tactics that help them better market and manage their practices so they can grow, improve profitability, and have more financial freedom. Very excited today to be joined by Louis Frisina. Louis is a renowned biotech entrepreneur and aesthetics industry thought leader. He's Harvard educated with over 30 years experience building multi-million dollar and billion-dollar ventures for companies such as Fisher Scientific, Collagenesis, QMed, Medicis, and more. He's an advisor currently to several private equity and hedge funds for merger and acquisition. And he actually discovered the aesthetic filler Restylane originally in Brazil and built the US market. So Louis doesn't even have a call to action. He's semi-retired, just doing private consulting, not even taking on clients at this point. So he just wants to give back to the industry, and we were fortunate enough to talk to him today and to have him share these benchmarks and insights from the hundreds of practices that he's worked with. So use these to measure up your practice, make sure that you're hitting these benchmarks, use this as a blueprint for success, and pay attention to the insights that Louis is providing us today. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the comments section, and we'll make sure to coordinate with Louis to get a response to those comments or questions. So with that said, let's jump into today's episode. Hey, Louis, welcome to the podcast. We're very excited to have you on today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rick, for joining us.
My audience members who aren't familiar with you, I know you've spoken at a lot of industry events, been around for a long time. Could you just give us a little bit of a background on yourself?
Sure. Well, this started actually back in 1997 when I became wind of a product called Restylane that was actually being sold only in Sweden and in Brazil, and became interested in the aesthetic space, went over to visit him, and the rest is history. I brought the product into the United States, took it through the FDA, which is not an easy thing to do, and the clinical trials and everything else, and then ended up getting the product registered and ultimately selling it at the time to a big aesthetic company called Medicis Pharmaceuticals to move ahead. So since that time, I've seen from here to Shanghai about 2,000 aesthetic medical practices. I've seen all of the good stuff and all of the bad stuff, and hopefully I can share some of this and pay a little forward to everybody who's on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm so excited, and I got to go through, Louis sent me over some materials to prepare for the interview today. So I was able to go over some of your previous presentations, some of your notes that are updated for 2024, and kind of just craft some questions to help guide our conversation today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about were some of your benchmarks that you had outlined, and then specifically related to those benchmarks, if you're a practice owner and you're listening to this and you feel like you're falling short of one of these stats, where you generally see, Louis, people falling short in terms of, operations management that cause these things to happen. So the first number that you had in your presentation, I know this one's going back a few years, was the $2,400-ish service revenue per patient. Was that an annual amount?
That actually was an annual amount. The average spend per patient that I have, and it's about 258 recorded with P&Ls and over years and everything else. So I've got a database of practices that I've worked with and have helped consult and advise to over the many years, is about, I think it's $563 per every time that they come in. We'll get to that a little later. Best practices take multiple bites out of the apple out of that particular patient. So it's not just a one-off annual $563 or $600. They're averaging about 3.2 to 4 procedures. They're basically bringing in that customer through a treatment plan or through upselling and cross-selling almost 4 times a year for separate procedures and looking in the tools of the toolbox that the practice has.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. Yeah, that was the next thing, that 3.8 visits per year. And is that data that you have, is that crossing over from, I know the med spa space is the lines are very gray, right? They're dermatology practices, plastic surgeons, just strictly med spas. How does that data break down in terms of practice type?
The med spas have a tendency of actually bringing in those patients more frequently than medical aesthetic dermatology practices or the surgical plastic surgery med spa practices.
Okay, interesting.
So and that number would probably exceed 4, on an annual basis. And that was the trick during the Great Recession, and it was the trick during COVID, was to basically, not everybody was coming in during that time, but for those who were coming in who wanted to continue with their aesthetic maintenance and regimen, those were the ones that they decided to go after because they were the ones who were opening their pockets, had the credit card, and were willing to continue their program.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know people listening to this, you have people concerned about, economic economic headwinds and inflation and things like that and people spending less money. But you just outlined two examples, right? Great Recession years, COVID, where you were in those types of situations working with practices. And one of the ways to get past that is you might have less people coming in, but to increase the frequency at which your customers who haven't been affected, right? In every economic downturn, their income might have gone up $50,000, $100,000 this year. So any strategies for getting that number up, like making sure that you're kind of hitting that benchmark of 4+ potentially visits per year?
There's a number of ways, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the patient journey and experience in that practice. And you're trying to do two things. You're trying to get them to come in more frequently, and you're trying to have them meet the pricing without having to go to some type of commoditized pricing in your practice. So you're trying to keep your prices up because you're getting squeezed by some of the big vendors out there, and you're trying to increase the frequency they're coming in. That requires special treatment. And in best practices, that can be anywhere from putting together and establishing a VIP program for those particular patients where they get special emails and text blasts and various specials and various events. But it's the touch points to those individuals that these practices continue to stay in contact with them, almost as if they were friends, and reminding them to come to the website because there's a new procedure or a new provider or, a new treatment that the practice has brought in and stuff. So.
Yeah, so some people I know are like afraid of over communicating. They don't want to be annoying. But like you just said, if you're kind of treating the relationship as a personal relationship like you would be a friend, you're sharing that kind of stuff with a friend. So does that kind of play into the psychology of what you're trying to do there is make sure that communication is personalized, that it doesn't feel like you're annoying the prospects because you do ideally have a relationship with your clients?
Yeah, it's all about the trust. And, you're putting your face and your body in the hands of somebody else. And this is a voluntary procedure. It's not a medically necessary procedure. So patients increasingly are more careful about, who they have as providers. And, this is the aesthetic market. These are people who are, continuing to travel and continuing to spend money on their self-care and wellness. And they will spend it. And they will spend it wisely, but they will also spend it significantly and materially, as they do with many of the practices that I'm involved with. The bottom line is that you've got to, create that value in that practice and that meaningfulness and that trust in order for them to be able to come in more frequently and be able to pay the prices that you're doing. And it's not different too much than the hospitality industry and so forth. When you go into a St. Regis or a Ritz-Carlton, there's a certain expectation of service, but there's also, from a consideration from their side, a consideration that you're willing to pay those prices and you're willing to, to be able to come in at the frequency that you're doing. So it's a two-way street, and best practices manage that two-way street on a continuous basis, almost weekly, with touch points with these key providers. And that could also be a phone call. And there are other mechanisms besides them just coming in, communicating them via text or e-blasts or, through some type of proprietary social media mechanism.
So you're trying to leverage any sort of communication you can to get that relationship to become closer and closer and closer, where it's the norm that you're getting a phone call every week, just checking in, seeing how things are going and asking if you need anything.
Otherwise in the market today, the market is down 6 to 12% this year, based upon some of the funkiness, in our macro environment and some of the political things that are going on. So there's a little reservation on the part of a lot of people to hold their coins, so to speak, in their pocket. But there are many that are continuing to go out, and I have best practices that are up 20% this year in the middle of this, macro environment. And it is because of this journey. When you talk to those patients, they're not going to go anywhere. They're highly retained by these particular people. They have vested their time and their emotions, into whether it's an esthetician or a mid-level provider or the doctor himself in the practice.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm thinking about if you go to a hair salon, right? You've built a certain relationship with that person. A haircut is not a haircut. You go to that person because you're going to get a specific outcome. You're going to have a certain level of service and treatment, and you have that relationship. You want to develop that type of relationship in your med spa. You don't want it to be Walgreens where people think they can just grab the product or service off the shelf at the place that's most convenient to drive past.
Exactly. And people will travel for that. out of their schedule to go to that one individual. And it's the same type of relationship that, that is maintained almost religiously with a lot of these providers. They're constantly there for them. That doesn't mean just between 9 and 5. That sometimes is during the evening. A patient coordinator will call a prospective client, or an esthetician or a mid-level or a doctor will actually make contact with them even on the weekends. This is, to some extent, a little of a 24/7 business that extends beyond 9 to 5 during the evenings. That also includes work hours, and also on the weekends, and that also includes office hours there as well.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with that. I don't use this example a lot on the podcast. I do it a ton on my YouTube channel. But one of my favorite quotes in marketing is from a book called The Advertising Effect. And the quote is, "Action changes attitude faster than attitude changes action." And it's the idea that the best way to shape the perception of a prospect is to get them to come in and have a great experience doing business with you. And they're going to know, like, and trust you based on that personal experience at a level that's different than anything they could just see or read in third-party online reviews. So I always mention, my wife and I, you just said, we still drive to our dentist 35-40 minutes into the west side of Nashville. We live in the suburbs east because we know, like, and trust them based on personal experience. So you'll have stickiness if you're providing a high level of service to your clients.
Right. But otherwise, if you don't have that, you're subject to a 6 to 12% decline in the market, which means less patients coming in. You're subject to commoditization in your pricing, and ultimately, from a financial standpoint, subject to declining profitability in your practice. That's the abyss, and that's the spiral downward that you're trying to avoid. And hopefully some of the tips that I can give you today will help you kind of stay away from that abyss.
Yeah, and I like that Ritz-Carlton example. Like, right, people are expecting to pay a high price point when they go to the Ritz-Carlton, but they're also expecting a high level of service. So it's a two-way street. Correct. And we just did a video on the YouTube channel and said, putting the spa in med spa, right? You really want to focus and emphasize level of service. So any specific actionable tips where you find practices that are maybe they're just okay, they're middle of the road, they're not doing anything abhorrent, but they're just not achieving a top-notch customer experience, where you see people generally falling short?
Right. And it starts when they walk into the reception room. Sometimes the lighting is a little different. It's dimmed down versus in the exam room. There could be, slight music in there. In my best practices, people at reception stand up and greet them. Sometimes they even go away from their particular chair and come out and greet them and shake their hand, bring them to their chair. Ask them, even especially if there's a little of a backlog in terms of their waiting time, asking them, anything that they need at that point in time. And that could be anything from lunch to when I was in London offering prayer rugs to some of the Muslim clients because they were coming in at that time of day and knew that that was an important thing. And it's paying attention to that detail that creates that unique journey experience, that you're just not walking into a place to get 25 units of Botox.
Yeah,
it's not about the Botox. People are in there for self-care, for self-confidence, and to enjoy a pleasant and hopefully memorable experience that might be different when they walk out of there than the rest of their day. Whether it's family or children or pressures at work or pressures with financials, it's that one period of time that they have for themselves, that's only for themselves, and helps them both mentally and physically improve their self-care and awareness. Wellness.
I like that little tip about, like, even getting the person to lunch. Like, there's a little bit of a wait. Like, there's a coffee shop next door. Let me go grab you a coffee. What can I get for you while you're waiting? Like, so instead of just thinking to yourself as a practice owner, our staff is nice. They welcome people when they come in. The office is clean. Trying to find the things that can really help you go above and beyond to create an exceptional client experience.
Clients in focus groups, you find out that these clients and patients are looking at every single touch point when they come out of the elevator or when they walk into the med spa, in terms of the cleanliness and the greeting and the feeling that, in best practices, they know exactly who's coming in by photos. So when they come in, they actually say their name. It's a nice thing to be recognized among a crew of other people in the reception area that, that you're well noted and that you're special. For $500, $600, $1,000, $2,000 that they're going to spend to you in less than an hour, they should feel special about that.
That's great. I love that. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? So like the idea of a first patient coming in, and instead of them checking in at the front desk and saying, "What's your name?" and having to piece the conversation together, to literally see them walk in the front door and have a picture or reference so you literally can welcome them by name. How do you do
Yeah.
that logistically?
What happens is the night before, in best practices, the practice manager who's responsible for managing the day, the patient flow and efficiency daily, they will look the night before at the patients that are coming in. They'll know who are whales, people who spend $6,000 or $7,000 in skincare. They'll know some of the people who might be a little difficult. The next morning, they will have something which is absolutely imperative in every practice, and I please recommend that you do it. It's called the daily huddle. You have employees coming in the morning from an evening or a morning commute that, could cause all type of disruption and discombobulation in terms of their focus, walking through those doors. And that daily huddle basically kind of organizes and focuses all of the employees on the people and the flow and efficiency that's coming in that day to get them really understanding what's going to happen during that 8 hours, where they're double booked and triple booked, where there's going to be issues, where the heavy duty VIP customers are coming in. And that 10 or 15 minutes before the day starts is absolutely critical. It's done in every single one of my best practices, and it helps for sure organize that flow and efficiency. And there's a way of conducting those huddles, which, I have my own tricks to be able to, optimize that opportunity. Calling out one of the staff from the day before in terms of how great of a job they did with that particular customer that was referenced yesterday, and hopefully Sally or Judy or Ben and so forth with this VIP coming in, you'll be able to do the same thing that was done yesterday with one of your team colleagues.
Yeah, that's great. What great nuggets. It's just reinforcing, it's kind of reinforcing so many ideas on previous episodes. And I think the realization I'm coming to is that as a med spa owner, medical aesthetics business owner, you have to really be a business person first and foremost, almost. Like you can't just understand the medical side and know how, like I know how to administer Botox so I can open a med spa. You really have to get good at these other things for your business to really be successful. You have to understand operations, standardizing processes, customer experience, managing a team, and all those things really have to come together or you're going to struggle.
Absolutely. And this is, at the end of the day, managing profit and loss statement, and the practice manager and the owner, are responsible for this. In an average med spa, and especially with commoditization going on, you're trying to maintain and hold as much of that gross profit margin as you possibly can. So, if a neurotoxin is costing you almost $7 a unit and you're selling it for 10, and that's a little high on the cost per unit there, but just to keep it simple, that's a 70% cost of goods. That's a 70% gross profit margin that that you're going to have to try to maintain here, and it creates squeezes and stuff like that. And so the average best practice med spa is trying to hold on to a 70+% gross profit margin, because most of the business that they're doing is around injectables, whether it's dermal fillers or neurotoxins. After that, you only have with 70 cents on the dollar that you brought in, knowing that you're going to have 30 cents to give to one of the top vendors out there. You have 70 cents to be able to cover all of your operating expenses for the month and be able to make a profitability. And, at the point in time when you're interested in selling, and I'm involved in a lot of those transactions at this point in time, they're looking for 20 to 25% on the bottom line. So if you've got 70% on a gross profit margin, you really only have 45 cents to be able to cover on an average basis the rest of your operating expenses. And that means keeping all of those operating expenses in their lane. Those, whether it's the rent or the marketing or the staff expenses or the incentive compensation or the medical supplies or any of the other things that impact those operating expenses before you finally get down to profitability. So especially in 2024, this is micromanaged by the best practices, and they manage it on a daily basis. On a monthly basis, I have 3-hour, 4-hour reviews of the month, and we may go through 100 and 150 KPIs and metrics to make sure we understand what happened during that month, what corrective action we can take, for the next month, and what corrective action we can take on a timely basis.
So
it truly is a business.
Yeah. So you mentioned those lanes and understanding the benchmarks for each of these lanes. Could you give us just some general guidelines that you're usually using?
The average practice, they're bringing in, say, $100,000 a month. I'm just going to use it as an example. $70,000. They spend $30,000 on cost of goods, what they pay in tips and consumables and neurotoxins and dermal fillers and all of that stuff, and they end up with $70,000, for that month in terms of gross profit margin. They've got about $45,000 to basically cover their overhead if they're going to come up with a 20 to 25% profitability. Where does that 45% go and so forth? You shouldn't be spending more than about less than 5% on your rent. If you're spending more than that, then you're going to either have to generate more revenue or you're going to have to figure out how to manage that rent expense. And sometimes people take on, new rents, new facilities, new costs, new tenant improvements and so forth. Don't purposefully, when they're planning these things, make sure that it stays within that 5%. In the area of marketing, which is more complicated, the cost of marketing has gone up because of the level of noise out there and the level of vehicles that you have to attend to. It's not just SEO that you have to pay for, the $1,500 to $2,500 a month to maintain directories and linkages with your webmaster and so forth. This also involves Google ads, Meta ads, Instagram, all types of costs there. Cost to put together e-blasts, cost to put together events, cost to go out, on a weekly basis for community outreach and visit other key influencers in the market, like you said, hair salons and Pilates and yoga studios, where you would find similar patients going to these other influencers that you might be able to bring into your practice and so forth. That number is like 7 to 8% at this point in time. It used to be 4.5 to 5%, but it's becoming increasingly expensive, and best practices who are profitable and growing, are spending at that aggressive level, and quite frankly, in my best practices, are outspending the local competition and taking their market share. And that's what that's about and so on. In the area of staff, which is your most expensive expensive cost and cost lane and so forth, that all depends upon, quite frankly, what you have in terms of mix of estheticians and mid-levels and doctors and so forth. But, estheticians shouldn't be making more than 15 to 20% of what they're generating in terms of gross revenue. Mid-levels shouldn't be, costing you more than 20 to 25% to deliver that gross revenue. And doctors shouldn't be, honestly charging the practice or having doctors in the practice that are generating revenue and are asking for more than 30, maybe 35%. But it's the mix of all of those different providers in a practice, the esthetician mix, along with the mid-level provider mix, along with the doctor mix, especially in a med spa, that keeps that cost effectively in a lane that shouldn't exceed around 22 to 25%. And then you have some medical supplies, the cotton balls and swabs and other things like that, that should be 2 or 3 or 4%. And then you have other miscellaneous expenses, a lot of other little miscellaneous expenses that have to be managed. But the ones that I just mentioned are the ones that are key to ensuring at the bottom line that you're generating profit. Otherwise, you're running a nonprofit. The patients are coming in, that you're charging them $100, you're making $70, you're spending all of that $70 basically paying for the operating expenses of the business. And at the end of the month, you've generated no additional value for the practice, and quite frankly, no opportunity when you're ready to be able to have a liquidity event and quite frankly, a life-changing evaluation and a payout that a lot of these practices deserve. But it's a journey to get there, and it's not an easy journey, and sometimes it takes 6 months, sometimes it takes 12 months to be able to, quite frankly, straighten out some of these profit and loss statements. Some of them are hard decisions that have to be made by the practices, and some of them are low-hanging fruit and just need to be implemented and executed.
All episodes. This episode is brought to you by MedSpa Magic Marketing, my agency. We help med spas and aesthetics practices grow with more effective marketing strategies. And I know that's a vague phrase, right? It's a vague claim. So I have an offer for you. I offer this to any new prospects. If you're interested in exploring another marketing option, a new agency, or just getting into Facebook, Instagram, Google Ads for the first time, I'd love to show you why we're different, what we're doing for clients. And we can do that via a 1.5 hour planning session where I'll outline a specific marketing plan and I'll give you all of the blueprints that we would implement if we were to do business together. Now you can take that, use that on your own, hire someone else to help you execute it, or work with us. We really don't hold anything back on that strategy call. And I think you'll have a lot of confidence in how you manage your marketing investment moving forward, understanding some of the nuances that can help you implement more effective marketing strategies for your business. So if you want to do that, you can go to medspamagicmarketing.com. I guess real quick on that, what are the things that you see that are low-hanging fruit generally? Like if you had to kind of, most of the time, if you see certain things that pop up in that low-hanging fruit column, what are those things? And then what are the things that you're usually having to take a hard look at? And then one of the things that comes to mind is that 5% rent benchmark. I talked to Dr. Carol Clinton, one of the co-authors of MedSpa Confidential, before she passed. We were lucky to have her on the podcast. And she talked about this idea of right sizing. If you've got a space that's too big, do you have any tips or insights on kind of managing those expenses and where you see the most common mistakes happening for practices that aren't profitable?
Right. So I had a practice, opened up a second location. We were targeting about, 5%, doing about $100,000 a month and the rent not being more than $5,000 in that time. They ended up doing half that amount of revenue for various reasons. And so that rent cost as a percentage of the total income statement went from 5% to 10%. What did we do? We actually decided, based upon what we could do from a revenue generating standpoint, we could only do what we could do. We went back to the landlord to see if we could get some rent dispensation. Of course, he said, nice try, and there wasn't anything that actually, quite frankly, that could happen there. So what we decided to do was to bring in other lookalike providers that could either rent the space or participate in the reduction of that rental expense. And so, for instance, in one of the practices, which has great procedure rooms, they brought in a plastic surgeon that was able to do minor surgeries in a procedure room, and he was blocked out. He happened to be blocked out in time with the hospitals and so forth. So he started coming about 2 or 3 and now 4 times a month. And that actually has now brought that rental expense, as an example, down to about 3.8%. And they're quite happy as they're trying to build their own revenue. And sometimes stuff doesn't happen as planned. But the brightest minds, even including myself, we weren't anticipating sitting on 50,000 versus the 100,000. We had that locked and loaded, but something else happened in the marketplace. It doesn't matter. Fog happens, as we say in Nantucket, and you can't get that plane over and land and see your family over on the weekend. And just like in life and in business and so forth, stuff happens. And you've got to be able to put together contingencies and not allow that to continue, because that's where the laziness and it becomes now a structural cost to the business. Now I'm 5 points over my rental lane now, and I can't do anything about it, or you think you can't do anything. Now I've got to 5 points. Now you're trying to steal 5 points from other parts of the P&L statement. You try to take it out of your employees. You try to take it out of your marketing and so forth. You try to take it out of fundamental areas out of the practice and so forth to increase or improve your profitability. And you're quite frankly robbing Peter to pay Paul.
What a perfect quote, because I just had a client use that quote on a call last week, robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's how she felt like she was managing her practice.
And I find that happening all the time, because it's a hermetically sealed job. You're not going to get more. Maybe you'll get 75% gross profit margins, but you're not going to get more than that if you're doing the regular things. And I would encourage med spas out there that are primarily injectable providers to start looking at other procedures and other silos to bump up that gross profit margin, because inevitably there is a squeeze going on with the vendors, and there's a squeeze going on in the pricing because of the level and number of people who are coming into this very exciting and long-term attractive market and opportunity.
Yeah. What good advice. Be creative. You can't just ignore that number. You got that rent expense. All of a sudden it's 12% of your revenue, and you're just hoping it goes away or that you're going to make up for it somewhere else. At some point you have to make the decision to fix the problem and to address the situation, and getting creative with solutions like you just mentioned is
right. And fixing that problem on a timely basis.
Yeah.
The best of my practices, the owner sees the revenue on a dashboard at 5:03 p.m. every single day by provider and by procedure. He knows exactly what happened that day. He also knows what the budget was supposed to be for that particular day. And so some people are managing this in a real, and I think you have to granularize this opportunity. And, a day is extreme. A week is not uncommon for, meetings to occur with the manager and the patient coordinator and the providers to look at opportunities to improve or make calls or do other things, that are necessary in the coming week. But inevitably, all of my practices have a monthly review. They get the financials in. We wait about 5 to 10 days from the accountants to kind of record the accurate and complete financial statements. We take a look at them. We start, going through a deep dive of all of the metrics that surrounds those numbers. And by the time we get through that review, we know exactly where we are, we know exactly where we're not, and we know exactly where we need to get to. And everybody has to do that. There isn't any extra time in this business to waste anymore, because when you're not doing that and I'm involved in a practice down the road, that's not a good thing for you.
Yeah. For those of you listening, how many times do you have to hear some of these things related to financials and understanding that these things are going to make or break your business? Like, identify the issues and create a course of action to resolve these problems. You have to stare them down. You can't just hope they go away.
And you got to do it on a timely basis.
Yeah.
It's more about the window of opportunity in terms of business success than it is necessarily about the amount of opportunities that you have.
Louis, you had a note on one of your presentation documents talking about equipment purchases, and it's been a common topic on the podcast. I wanted to get a little bit of related to this conversation around financials, what you're seeing, what you generally recommend around evaluating your equipment purchases.
Yeah. So there was a world, there was a day, and we've all been through that, and they're now door knockers, or door stoppers as we call them, where $200,000, $300,000 purchases were being made. And, salespeople, sometimes earnestly, most of the time, would represent that, doc, all you need is 27 patients to come through at $6,000, or $8,000 or $20,000, a patient, and you'll be able to pay for this in 3 months or 6 months. Well, that went to 9 months, that went to 12 months, that went to 15 months, that went to 24 months. And I think we all got a little smarter about what we were doing in terms of the return on investment and economics of these primarily energy-based devices and so forth, which are capital equipment, and are expensive. Everybody should know that, these capital equipment companies, they have somewhere between a 60 to 80% gross profit margin or more on those pieces of equipment. So these things are not costing them $200,000 to build. Some of them that are very high quality are more expensive, but not even close to the numbers that we're talking about. So what best practices do is they'll do two things, and some of them have leverage that not smaller practices have, but in the bigger practices with more leverage, they'll tell that person, if they're serious about it, drop it off for a week or two, leave some consumables. We'll test it out with our patients and see what the uptake is. And if we're good, we'll end up paying cash for that piece of equipment. Don't worry about financing with us or anything else. That's one strategy out there. In the smaller practices and so forth, I would not recommend these higher cost expensive purchases at this point in time. I would be looking for more like $50,000 to $100,000 opportunities, because you're going to find out that average cost per procedure is going to be lower than what they represented, in their ROI analysis, and you've got to discount almost everything that they say. And we do that. I work with very, very small practices, $1 million, $2 million practices, that talk to me all the time, and we're looking for, the best, safest piece of equipment that we can purchase, but you have to do it on an economic basis. Right now, I don't have that many pieces of equipment out there that I'm strongly recommending. I'm recommending actually other silos for them to go into that don't have that high hurdle, that high initial cost of capital to get into actually doing a procedure. And more med spas are looking at non-capital intensive silos to go into, and we can talk about those at the appropriate time.
Yeah, I guess, can we jump to those now? Because that's been my experience talking to practice owners. What you just reiterated right there, I think is so true. And when you look at those percentages and you're doing financial planning, really throws a wrench into your numbers when you have a $400,000, $300,000 machine and no business purchasing the product. So yeah, it's
Right.
great. So in terms of some of those additional services to bring in extra revenue that aren't as
Right.
capital intensive.
So when we look at the market right now, there's a little morphing going on between aesthetics, the outer beauty, and the inner beauty or health of a lot of these patients. And of course, if you take care of some of the fundamental internal things, functionally with patients and so forth, that actually can improve the health and well-being of your skin and facial appearance and body appearance and other things. But most recently, and because of this capital equipment issues that are out there, a lot of the med spas and a lot of the best practices, whether they're combined derm aesthetic practices or combined plastic surgery med spa practices, are looking into three other areas. One is weight management and control, and that is the Ozempic, the semaglutide, and the tirzepatide crew. This is not going away. This is a fundamental opportunity for med spas. They're charging, $500 per patient to have them do a procedure like this. They're seeing instantaneous results, so there's self-gratification. These patients are coming in to manage their weight loss and their BMI on a once-a-month basis. They're starting to improve and feel good about themselves. Suddenly, they're talking about other procedures that they cross-sell and upsell with these patients. The second area is hair restoration. These are the fastest growing opportunities. And hair restoration, can be done two ways. One, autologously through something called PRP, which allows you have to get one of these spinners. You're spinning down blood and extracting the plasma and then re-injecting that into the forehead. There are other products that are off the shelf that patients that are getting aware of, and practices surely are getting aware of, and that's the area of exosome therapy, which is a payload of immune and growth factors. And there's a number of exosome companies out there, some much better than others. Please be careful about that, and please email or text me if you'd like to hear any more about the exosome area. But that's a phenomenal growth opportunity in the hair restoration area. The two areas that I've talked about at this point in time cost you nothing from a capital equipment entry and hurdle basis, and they're the fastest growing. The two of the fastest growing areas, that we see in the market right now is weight management, control, and health, body health, as well as exosome therapy, whether it's therapy or in your skincare. And I highly encourage these practices to take a hard look out there, and there are really good. Many good opportunities, and best practices have already incorporated this kind of wellness piece into that, so that they're doing almost a 360-degree view of the patient. And when you're taking care of their weight and you've lost weight in front of you, besides all the crying and the, oh my God, I've been doing this for 30 years and nothing has worked, those pockets are wide open for you. You'll never lose that patient. And if you do exosome therapy or something like that, and you've got hair regeneration, these products work, or PRP, and you've restored some of the health and the loss from alopecia or from COVID or from stress in our society and so forth, these are all high retentive, highly satisfied, highly enthusiastic and exciting patients to want to do more with you.
Yeah, you're eliminating risk in terms of the capital expense, and you're generating a result that makes clients happy. Win-win.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And they're available. And these two weren't available 5 or 10 years ago, but they're available today. And it's female and male. So we're not just dependent upon, 85% of the patients coming in to be female. We now have a 50-50 split between body health and weight management, as well as hair loss as well. And those are two areas. There are other areas, but that has to do with the customization and specifically with the practices at this point in time.
Yeah, that's great. Phenomenal advice. The last thing I wanted to wrap up with here in terms of discussion was one of the presentation sheets that you sent me had this note about a suggestion that your top practices, the best practices that you work with, top performers, were averaging 5.8 days per week that they were open. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Obviously, nobody's open for maybe 5.8 days exactly, but where that number comes from and the advice that backs that recommendation?
Yeah, it turns out that Mohammed actually had to go to the mountain after all. It didn't look like that in the Bible and in other religious scripture and so forth, but it's a new world. And quite frankly, it's understandable. There are people, I can talk about this 25, 30 years ago. Somebody in the middle of the day had to go to a doctor's office. Somebody had in the middle of the day had to pick up their kids. Somebody in the middle of the day had to do something. They go out the door. Everybody would understand it. Sometimes the hours would be made up. Sometimes it wouldn't be. This is a very different employment environment. Employee-employer relationships are a very, very sensitive area. And from a risk mitigation standpoint, has to be really, really watched, quite frankly, at this point in time. But best practices, and some of them go back 5 years ago. I have best practices that were open 2 to 3 nights a week and 7 days a week 5 years ago. And those are the ones that achieve the profitability. They're the ones that actually ended up getting sold because, those private equity people are looking at these hard-working, you're open 3 nights a week to 8 o'clock and you're there, and you're open on the weekends and you're there on Saturdays and Sundays. This is the type of person we want to have on our management team, in the next phase of this, market consolidation and restructuring about how procedures and other things are delivered. But people just don't have that time anymore. And, and they're busy, and they're not just busy, by the way, with the regular things having to do with family. They have self-care to do, and they're working out, or they're biohacking, or they're resting and so forth. And so they need other, more convenient times to be able to bring these. So my average practice in those 250, it's 1.8 nights per week, which means pretty close to 1 or 2 nights they're open to 8 o'clock. You could look at other parts of the week. Maybe you close a little earlier on Friday afternoon because it's just not one of those markets that people are going to, to be able to be convenient. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of places on Friday afternoon that are slightly a little slower. We make up that a little on the weekend and so forth. And then, on the weekends they're open. They're not open necessarily on Sunday, but most of them are open realistically between 10 and 4 on Saturday. And there are plenty of professionals that are coming in. And there are plenty of professionals that are coming in, not just for aesthetic procedures, but for things like IV therapy, for like glutathione, for self-care and management. And that takes, 45 minutes an hour, and they want to do it on their free time, maybe after going to the gym, and then they go get their IV push, their IV therapy, whether it's GLUT or NAD number of vitamin building up so that they can get back into the workplace or into their, somewhat stressful, family or personal lives coming into the next week. And you've got to do that. And it's not just about best practices. It's basically a sea shift in the convenience, again, and providing an experience to those patients, as I said at the beginning, that basically makes them special. That you're special enough that we'll see you on a weekday night. You're special enough that we'll see you on a Saturday, and God help us on a Sunday. So
I did a presentation earlier this year on marketing, and we talked about how people make purchase decisions. And I kind of reject the idea a little bit of a unique value proposition. I think it's these incremental differences in perceived value that help you stand apart. And people are making those decisions based on a combination of factors. Factors of know, like, and trust, reputation, reviews, factors related to price, and factors related to convenience. So this is one way to manipulate that subconscious scorecard on the factor of convenience. You're giving people the option to see you after work on Saturday. So instead of blueprinting your hours as to what you want to work and what you wish your schedule looked like, you have to map that to what your clients want.
Right. And it turns out, and I've been on many millennial market research and podcasts and everything else, the millennials are looking more, they want Mohammed to come to the mountain. They want that convenience. They want that opportunity to be able to feel a little more control over their lives, over their time, and where they spend it and what they spend it on. And so it's just it's a different cohort that I grew up with that was, 9 to 5 and, strictly and understood what was going on, didn't complain, stayed in line. And millennials kind of like just blew that whole mentality away, and probably for all the right reasons.
Yeah. Well, Louis, this was phenomenal. I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Any references or places that you would point people for additional information to kind of get more of just what you've taught and what you've been up to?
I don't have any public, things, but I mean, you're more than happy to email me or to text me. I'd be more than happy to respond to any of those follow-ups. Obviously, this is a short podcast. I've got, 100 metrics that, we haven't.
Yeah, I would love to do it again. Like, I would love to schedule another episode because, like you said, I'm sure we could go deep dive on so many of these different things. So if you're up for it, I'd love to
get a real understanding, a real more granular understanding of what it takes, in best practices to run a successful, growing, and profitable enterprise.
That might be the podcast episode title. Well, like, if you have any questions for Louis, put them in the show notes. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, there should be a Q&A section. And on YouTube, just leave them in the comment section. We'll make sure that we get to Louis and hopefully maybe correspond with some of you all. But Louis, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Ricky.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This podcast is a production of MedSpa Magic Marketing. If your med spa or aesthetic practice is in need of digital marketing services, help with advertising on Facebook, Instagram, Google, lead generation, and booking more appointments, please visit medspamagicmarketing.com.